Hello, and welcome to the Political Institutions and Political Economy workshop at the University of Southern California's Bedrosian Center. I'm Jeff Jenkins. I am the chair here, and I run the workshop. And today we have a very interesting workshop by Rachel VanSickle-Ward and Kevin Wallsten. Rachel is Professor of Political Studies at Pitzer College, and Kevin is Associate Professor of Political Science at Cal State University Long Beach. What they're going to present today is work from their recent book, their 2019 Oxford University Press book, The Politics of the Pill, Gender Framing and Policymaking in the Battle over Birth Control. And I'll just quickly read a couple sentences about the book, and then I'll turn it over to them. The announcement of a Health and Human Services rule requiring insurance providers to cover the cost of contraception as part of the Affordable Care Act sparked widespread political controversy. How did something that millions of American women use regularly become such a fraught political issue? In The Politics of the Pill, Rachel VanSickle-Ward and Kevin Wallsten explore how gender has shaped contemporary debates over contraception policy in the United States. And they're going to do a tag team today, and Rachel will start. So over to Rachel. And I think there was a note that if you have questions, you could either raise your hand or write it into the chat box. And I'll be observing and moderating that while Rachel and Kevin present. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that really lovely introduction. And thanks for having us here today. I also want to say a quick thanks to Aubrey and Anne and Rebecca for all the support on this workshop today. And of course, to Jen for serving as our discussant. We're really excited to be here and to talk about this project. I also want to wish everyone who celebrates a happy Lunar New Year. So with that, why don't I go ahead and pull up. Okay, so as Jeff mentioned, this is a co-authored book project between Kevin and I, and it is a work that also owes a lot of credit to a really wonderful group of undergraduates at Pitzer College who served as research assistants for a class that I did there. And I also love to show this slide right now because it harkens back to a time when we could all gather at each other's homes and when my couch is not completely taken over by pillow forts, which is how it looks right now. But I do mostly want to just give these students a lot of thanks for the early work they did in helping us develop the ideas and some content analysis. So really a collaborative endeavor. Okay, so what I'm going to do with the first section is give all of you an overview of the context for this project and basically break down the components of the analysis that we did and how they kind of fit together. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to do a deeper dive of that analysis. So I'll do more of the kind of broad strokes and situate what we were trying to do here and why it's important. And then he can tell you a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of the analysis. So I'll start with this image. This is an image that maybe most of us remember. It was an image that really sparked Kevin and I to do this project. But for those of you who may not be familiar with it or may need a refresher, after, as Jeff said in his introduction, after the Affordable Care Act included a component that preventative health should include a number of things, including contraceptive care. The then chair of the Oversight Committee, the House Oversight Committee, Daryl Issa, hosted a provocatively titled panel called Lines Crossed, Separation of Church and State. Has the Obama administration trampled on freedom of religion and freedom of conscience? So really not mincing any words there and how that congressman was framing this issue. Perhaps most notably, as you can tell from the image, the first panel was an all-male panel. So it was a panel to discuss this new birth control coverage, framed very much as a religious issue and calling on only men as the experts. There was actually a woman later in that day, but obviously doesn't change kind of the basic contours of this dynamic. So when this hearing was held, a number of things happened. first of all, it became a symbol of the fact that something that had been relatively quiet during the actual legislation process itself was now becoming very explosive. It was becoming much more politicized, much more of a partisan issue. And also it raised this issue of who has a seat at the table, right? And so there was a galvanizing moment during this hearing where women members of Congress stormed out saying they did not want to participate. And there was a tweet storm around the hashtag, where are the women? You know, why aren't women given a voice in a policy that is so central to their lives? So when we think about this image, one thing that it brings to mind is that there's truly nothing new, sadly, in American politics and elsewhere about all male panels deliberating issues of great import to women. So this is Anita Hill testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee during the confirmation process for Justice Clarence Thomas, who had been accused at that time of sexual harassment. Obviously a striking moment for a lot of us who are watching those hearings. And then frankly, there are any number of images like this from the prior administration. And again, I could show you, sadly, a whole talk's worth of these. I'm going to show just a few now, focusing on healthcare. So this is Trump signing the global gag rule, which affected world policy on reproductive rights. This is the Republican countermeasure to the Affordable Care Act. I think there might have been a woman in the corner off screen there. And then importantly, especially when we get to Kevin's section today, this is true in the media context as well. So you have a number of all male, there is one woman there, all male or nearly all male panels weighing in on something that in this case is really explicitly about women in terms of covering the Women's March. And then another recent example from the Corona Task Force under Trump, again, almost entirely men. So one thing that Kevin and I talked a lot about when we were developing this project is this is an issue that we'd long cared about. There's a lot of different entry points into discussing gender and representation, but this became so high profile, this kind of where are the women issue, and we really wanted to dive deep into the consequences of that. How and where does it matter that women are or are not at the table? And as gender and politics and policy and media scholars, we really wanted to do as comprehensive a perspective of that as possible on this one particular issue. I think it's probably worth just a moment to reflect on why reproductive rights is such a central issue and one worth talking about in political science. Ginsburg reflection here, I think, is quite apt, that it has to do very directly with women's rights more broadly. And also Justice O'Connor was talking about how women's ability to access reproductive rights really shapes our sort of overall citizenships and connection to our life experiences. And so kind of the overall takeaway, if you will, of the book is that representation does matter. There's this great refrain, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But I think it's worth exploring exactly what it is we mean by that. Why and how does representation matter? And so one thing that we picked up on early on was that there was all this really interesting, exciting, important work done on representation, but all too often that work was really siloed. So you had really important analysis of especially Congress and the legislative branch, some really good work on state politics. And then you would have a whole nother body of work on the executive branch, or more so lately on bureaucratic actors. And then there was this whole range of work in media scholarship. But a lot of times those voices weren't necessarily talking to each other. And importantly, those conclusions weren't always put in connection to one another. And so we thought it was worthwhile, especially of an issue, as we say, that is so fascinating in its own right, to say, well, let's do, one reviewer gave us this great phrase, a 360-degree perspective on what it looks like to assess the impact of gender at various points along the policymaking process. And how do those impacts aggregate? How do they interact? And how do they inform one another? And one thing that we found there, really a huge contribution of the book in our mind, is that when you do that, when you start to connect those dots and look with kind of a broad perspective, the impact of gender is striking. There really was a considerable influence that having women involved at various points of conversation or various deliberation points changed the outcome or changed the rhetorical frame. And one way to think about that is a small effect can get amplified. So for example, and Kevin will get into more of the nitty-gritty of this in a little bit, you could have the fact that a woman is reporting on something in contrast to a man lead her to cite maybe just a couple more sources that are women than the man would. And then those sources tend to talk about the issue in a different way. And then because they talk about that issue in a different way, the people consuming that story view it in a different way. And all of that gets, again, aggregated and amplified. So we think that this can be both a really important story about birth control, but also a really important story of how when you look for gender, it's helpful to connect those dots. And one thing that gender and politics scholars are very careful to say is a lot of times when we look in the more narrow strain, supposed gender effects can be kind of explained away by party, right? Or explained away by ideology or overwhelmed by professional norms. So again, it's helpful to look at it all in a broader context. I do want to say just a minute about what we see as some of the limits to our approach, because we think this is such a pressing and important issue. We think that there's always improvement to be made. And one sort of serious element we've been talking a lot about is that in this book, and I think in a lot of contemporary political science, we talk about gender in a just male or female perspective. And I think there's obviously a much more fluid way to appreciate that conversation and a sort of fuller way to operationalize that variable. And then the other thing sort of along those lines is I think we both hope that future work, when we look at the impact of something like birth control, considers the effect not just on cis women, but on trans men who also need access to birth control. And also, frankly, on trans women who are maybe not directly affected in terms of becoming pregnant, but are very much affected by conversations around gender that reduce women to sort of baby making or just their ability to bear children. So I think it's just a broader conversation to keep in mind there. Okay, so just briefly to say a minute about all of the elements that we cover of the birth control debate. Obviously, we look at the Affordable Care Act chiefly, and the element of including birth control coverage in that major policy. We also look at the state policies that led up to that congressional act. We spend a lot of time on how legislation then flowed into the bureaucratic structure and the rules and regulations that emerged. We look at the court responses to that legislation, and then we look at media sources, frames, and how public opinion reacted to that. And it's really those two key things that we'll dive into more today. But again, they're truly interconnected. I'm just going to briefly show you the some of the work that's done on representation. I'm guessing that a lot of people in this audience are kind of familiar with these terms, but there's a really important scholarly conversation about the extent to which descriptive representation, which is sort of a shared demographic characteristic. So if I am a woman and I'm elected to office and I represent other women, and substantive representation, which has to do with the policies that I might adopt or promote. Obviously, there's lots of ways to kind of complicate and problematize that relationship. And that's largely what we're digging into here. And as I said, there's a number of scholars doing really interesting work in this space. And they've found some effects on some level and also been sort of cautious about overstating the effects in others. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this one because I've covered a lot of this already. But I do want to note that the Women's Health Amendment, which is the critical language that we are looking at in terms of how it makes its way through the legislative process and then ends up being deliberated in the courts is pretty short and pretty ambiguous. So the legislation itself just covers this idea of preventative care as it applies to women. And then it was up to the agencies to decide what that preventative care included. So the Institute of Medicine, after the law was adopted, came up with recommendations that included birth control, but also a number of other elements of care, breast cancer screening, or support for lactation. So the birth control was kind of one piece of that, but quickly became the most explosive piece. I also want to say just a minute about, now that we know kind of what the policy is and its significance, that a central element of what we're considering here is the way that this policy is framed. And it's really a key contribution of the book, because with all this work we have on the impact of gender representation, one understudied area that we noticed was how gender affected how a policy was framed. And as we'll show, how a policy is framed has dramatic effects for how it is understood and how it evolves. And just for those of you who may not be familiar with the framing conversation, it's the idea of selecting an aspect of an issue and making it more salient, right? Defining an issue in a particular way. A lot of really important work done in this space as well, including by Jen Merolla, to think about framing not just sort of as a rhetorical device, but a serious consideration for activism, for policy construction, and again, for shaping public opinion and building coalitions. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Kevin.
As Rach was alluding to, I think the sort of guiding question of our book in many ways was on this issue: who speaks, what do they say, and how does it matter? And we look at this basic series of questions across a variety of different domains. I'm going to focus pretty narrowly now on the media coverage component of it. But I think some of the same things that we found with respect to media coverage were true, whether we're looking at the courts, whether we're looking at the legislatures at the state level or Congress, whether we're looking at public opinion. So I think the findings I'm going to highlight here are going to be kind of broadly applicable. Now, the basic question I want to start thinking about is how the presence or absence of women reporters shaped news coverage of the Affordable Care Act's contraception mandate. Now, in order to kind of organize this discussion, I think there are three key concepts that are worth describing in a little bit of detail here. I've framed this as generally as possible, actually, because I think in many ways, these are the most important questions confronting the media broadly today. And they all relate to questions of diversity. So three kinds of diversity. I'll describe what each of these briefly mean, talk about how they show up in our research, and just a little bit about how I think this is an important area of inquiry for those of us interested in improving, let's say, the quality of media coverage. So the first concept is byline diversity. This is just the simple question of how much diversity is there in terms of who is authoring the news, who is writing the news. Of course, diversity can mean many different things, and we had many different conversations in the media space about what the appropriate kind of diversity is. Of course, there are essential conversations to be had about racial or ethnic diversity, sexual orientation, socioeconomics. Obviously, there are questions about religion and region. Certainly after 2016, the media did a lot of reflection about whether a kind of urban bias was plaguing some of their coverage and preventing them from insights into perhaps what's going on in other parts of the country. We are focused here on the relatively narrow question of how much gender diversity there was and who authored stories about the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act. We're going to start just looking at how many stories were authored by women, how many were authored by men, and of course, how did those stories differ from each other, if at all. Another concept is source diversity, and this is who is quoted, who is called upon to speak in the media's coverage of any given issue. We, of course, are interested primarily in the question of gender here, that we could have taken this in a number of different directions. Certainly in the chapter that examines this empirically, we also explore things like occupational diversity and whether there's a kind of excessive tendency to rely on elite actors or people who occupy positions within formal institutions or organizations. And we might think critically about what the consequences of that heavy dependence, let's say, on existing elites to guide our policy discussions are. Finally, we have this idea of frame diversity, which is a subset of the concept of content diversity within journalism studies and mass communication. Here, we're just interested in the question of how much diversity was there in terms of the frames applied by the news when talking about the contraceptive mandate. And even more narrowly, we're going to be interested here in examining how frequently news reports adopted an explicitly gendered frame in their discussion of contraception, or how often they marginalized or minimized or maybe completely ignored discussions of gender or the gendered implications of the contraceptive mandate. So these are all kind of descriptive questions. I think they're important, obviously, for a variety of reasons. I want to talk about those, but also I want to discuss a sort of, I hesitate to say causal, but a more kind of a detailed explanation of the relationship between these various kinds of diversity. So when we start looking at the relationships, thinking about the relationship between byline, source, and frame diversity, a couple chapters of our book deal with this explicitly. So first, does more byline diversity produce more sourcing diversity? The basic question here is whether having more women reporters leads to having more women cited as sources in the media's coverage of the contraceptive mandate. When we start thinking about this, this becomes important, of course, not only because sources are sort of fundamental in shaping news coverage, right? This is a key finding from the literature in journalism and mass communications, that that sources in some ways are driving the coverage. But also, we think about this more representationally, that media organizations can legitimize certain kinds of actors and delegitimize others by either allowing them to speak or not allowing them to speak in the coverage of news events that affect them. We, in chapter 7 of the book, extend our research a little bit here and start exploring the relationship between byline diversity and sourcing diversity in terms of producing frame diversity. So we look not only at whether the coverage that coverage produced by women cites women's sources more frequently, but also whether both of those factors in turn produce a series of articles that are framed in a different way. And specifically, what we want to do here is see whether there's a relationship between the gender of the author, the gender of the sources cited, and the types of frames that are employed, with, again, this idea that news stories can be framed primarily around gender or explicitly mentioning gender or focusing on the gendered consequences of contraceptive policy, or they could adopt a much different frame that sidelines or ignores those concerns. I will point out that one of the features, I guess, of studies that have been done previously about gender's impact on news coverage is that we have a real mixed bag here. There's not much guidance in terms of specifying formal hypotheses that might, in fact, hint at what we could expect to find. Studies of the relationship between byline, source, and frame diversity are relatively rare. They tend to focus mostly on things like election coverage, not on something like contraceptive policy, which is a kind of more explicitly gendered, just as a matter of fact. And they often have very, very mixed findings. This is another one of those areas, as Rachel was alluding to, where it's not clear exactly what the impact of gender should be, because gender's influence has to be weighed against things like professional norms, organizational routines, and of course, pressures towards conforming, let's say, to the expectations of the audience. Particularly that's true in the news business. So in some empirical stuff that I'm not going to discuss as much, in chapter 9, we experimentally manipulate some news coverage in order to try to see exactly how much byline, source, and frame diversity shape the perceptions of news consumers. We measure, for instance, information, factual retention, and we look at opinions towards the Affordable Care Act. Now, I want to talk a little bit about just this chapter 6, chapter 7 set of findings, where we're examining the question of how much byline diversity is there, how much source diversity is there, how much frame diversity is there, and what is the relationship between byline, source, and frame diversity. So we start by looking at a year's worth of news coverage on the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. We identified these articles using LexisNexis. We are focusing here exclusively on the print media. So this is not a study of broadcast media, which might operate according to an entirely different set of dynamics. We just don't know. It's not a study, of course, of the online space, which presumably functions again according to a different set of dynamics. But looking only at the print media, we see a ton of coverage that's going to be catalyzed or produced by the all-male panel that Rachel pointed out at the beginning of the talk. Our range of data here is going to run from August 1st, 2011, which is the announcement of the mandate, and August 1st, 2012, which is just a convenient way of capping it. It's a year. It also has some substantive significance, but we want to keep in mind too that whatever we're going to find is constrained to this time period, and certainly the dynamics of this are going to change in the summer of 2012 as a response to the presidential campaign between Obama and Romney. And as we could talk about, a central theme in that campaign was the so-called war on religion. That was the argument of the Romney camp and the Republicans, and the war on women, which was a kind of refrain advanced by the Obama campaign. So we scraped 3 basic features from this data, right? We scraped who authored these 191 news reports. We classified that by gender. We looked at the sources, and of course, we looked at the frames. So first, with respect to this byline diversity question, we classified each author as male, female, or unknown. And in the unknown camp, we included those articles authored by more than one person. The results of our findings are difficult to interpret, I think, in the abstract. So it was the case that men authored more news reports about the contraceptive mandate during the time frame of our study than women. The exact breakdown was 55% of stories were authored by women, by men, 45% authored by women. As I point out, other scholars have found larger disparities, in fact, in coverage of reproduction issues. Certainly, we have data on newsrooms more broadly, and American newsrooms are 35% women, 65% male across the country. And so when we look at 45%, certainly that's below parity, but it is in fact a larger representation for women in terms of who's reporting the news on this story than we would find in newsrooms more broadly, and then has been found in other studies that have looked at reproductive issues more broadly. So we have here just the first piece of the puzzle, byline diversity. There's more men authoring stories than women. With respect to the source diversity question, we scraped every cited or quoted source in all of these 191 news reports. We did that by just looking for key phrases, again, that indicate somebody's being cited or quoted or referenced. For each of those quoted sources, we coded gender and we coded organizational affiliation. We broke down that in the following way, which is consistent with previous research. We placed each source into one category of of these possible 8 categories. The big distinction, again, within the literature is whether people are sort of being quoted as representatives of an institution or an organization, or whether they're your typical sort of average person who might be let's say the beneficiary of a policy or might bear the burdens of any policy change. So we wanted to code this as well to see whether source diversity would be sort of high with respect to gender, but also with respect to the occupational credentials, let's say. 586 sources cited overall. The vast majority of these, consistent with previous research, are official sources. That means elected officials, that means people running for office, that means people who perhaps occupy a leadership within the federal bureaucracy. It means interest group representatives, it means professors, academics, researchers, it means leaders of church organizations. Now, I should point out here that despite the fact that it is the case almost overwhelmingly the citations are going towards people within these organizations, there is in fact a lot of source inequality, which is to say you keep seeing the same relatively small number of people show up again and again and again and again. So in our data, the top 20 most quoted sources account for a quarter of all of the quotes. Now, this is, again, consistent with the research, but I will point out that when we start thinking about this in terms of gender, really there are only 2 women in this entire debate that are quoted repeatedly. And those 2 women are Kathleen Sebelius and Cecile Richards. So when we look at the question of source diversity, there is, of course, a way of thinking about it with respect to gender that is helpful and productive, I think, but it's also important to keep in mind that there is this inequality in terms of who shows up frequently. And even if women are accounting for a relatively large percentage of overall quotations, there is still this, I think, kind of important realization in that that could just be a relatively small subset of women who are being asked to speak. So overall, when we look at the data, 57% roughly were men, 43% were women. And lastly, I'll just point out that the entire disparity here between men and women comes from the fact that journalists have a tendency, as part of their professional development, as part of their professional norms, to cite elected officials. And because of the underlying, again, lack of representation for women, particularly in Congress, this produces, I think, a disparity in favor of men being cited over women. And the sort of unique role that religion is going to play in this debate means that reporters are going to frequently ask the Catholic Church, let's say, to comment, and that is going to produce, again, a sort of bias in favor of men. With respect to frame diversity, we coded all of the stories. This is a coding scheme that we applied to various parts of our analysis throughout the book. So the same basic 6 frames, we looked for how often they showed up in various kinds of venues. When we look at the media space, we coded each article as primarily focusing on either explicitly gendered parts of the contraceptive mandate issue or less explicitly gendered parts of the contraceptive mandate issue. So women's health, reproductive rights, debates about sexuality and morality, these were all explicitly gendered frames. The not explicitly gendered frames, where you would probably not hear any discussion of gender at all, or certainly not some discussion of the gendered aspects or consequences of the Affordable Care Act's contraceptive mandate. You see in the data here, kind of overwhelmingly, the issue was framed in a not explicitly gendered manner. So we again classified all these 191 articles. 75% of them fell into these not explicitly gendered categories. The most common frame actually employed is the strategic game frame. And this is a frame that media scholars have pointed out for a very long time is a kind of persistent feature of the American news media's coverage, a focus on polling, on strategy, on who's winning, who's losing, on the wisdom of particular messaging strategies, all of these kinds of things. Religious freedom was the second most common frame employed in the news media's coverage, going back to this idea that we had on the one hand a quote unquote war on religion versus on the other hand a war on women. You see here that this sort of war on religion frame gained a lot more traction within the media. Women's health, reproductive rights, and again, sexuality and morality were less common features. Now, what we wanted to do was just explore what the relationship between these various kinds of diversity were. Was it the case that women cited more women as sources? Was it the case that women reporters framed the issue in more explicitly gendered terms? Was it the case that perhaps stories that quoted women more prominently or more frequently were more likely to employ some of these explicitly gendered frames? So we look at this in a bivariate sense, again, just kind of looking for a simple correlation between these various kinds of diversity. We also run a series of models with a series of statistical controls to make sure that whatever we discover is not an artifact of leaving some other aspect of news coverage out. Particularly interesting, I think, was we were able to get some data from the American Society of Newspaper Editors about newspaper staff gender diversity. I won't talk about that in great detail here because it turns out to be not as important of a factor as byline diversity, but it's important to keep in mind that we're kind of controlling not just for who's authoring the report itself, but also for the composition of the newspaper staff more broadly. So what do we find? First of all, in chapter 6, we show that byline diversity does in fact increase source diversity. The descriptives here, I think, are pretty compelling. 52% of the sources cited in women-authored stories were women. In male-authored stories, less than 40% of the citations went to women. So we have a fairly significant difference in terms of who is being quoted based on who is authoring the story. In the multivariate analysis, this finding holds up. And when we look across the entire data set, it turns out on average, women reporters are citing about a half more additional woman source than male reporters. Now that might not sound like all that much, in fact, but as Rachel alluded to, when we start thinking about how this aggregates across a large number of articles across a large period of time, this can have quite significant consequences, particularly as we start to think about the ways in which news sources, in fact, shape frames as well, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, I just want to point one thing out here. This doesn't say anything about the causal mechanism driving this relationship. We're not sure whether women reporters are citing more women sources because they have different networks that they're drawing on in crafting their coverage. We're not sure if it might be kind of an explicit attempt to include a more diverse array of voices. We don't have any data on that, but I think that's something worth thinking about more carefully. So we also find evidence that byline diversity increases frame diversity. So when we look at the kinds of stories that are authored by male reporters and the kinds of stories that are authored by female reporters, we see, of course, that there's pretty significant differences. To be more precise, female reporters were much more likely in our data to write stories that frame the contraceptive mandate around questions of women's health and morality. Male reporters were far more likely to frame their stories around religious freedom and this sort of strategic games, elections, partisanship, horse race kinds of considerations. This holds up in the multivariate analysis as well. Again, the mechanisms here are not entirely clear. It could be that male reporters cover different beats than female reporters. It could be that this is a function of different ideological commitments or anything else. But the relationship here is pretty clear that when men and women author stories, they write about them in a different way with respect to the contraceptive mandate. Now, finally, source diversity. This is something we wanted to keep in mind. Research in mass communication suggests sources are essential in terms of determining framing. So if it's the case that women reporters cite more women sources, might it also be true that there's kind of an additive effect here where women frame the issue differently, but also the inclusion of more women sources will further lead to a focus on gender or gendered considerations in the coverage of the contraceptive mandate. Our multivariate analysis is pretty compelling here. The predicted probability of a story being framed around explicitly gendered concerns was dramatically different if there were no female sources as opposed to having all female sources. So we find here across all of this analysis, when women authored stories, news audiences were exposed to, again, a very different kind of coverage than when men published these reports. Women cited more other women in their articles. They wrote more explicitly about the gendered components of the contraceptive mandate. What's more, they wrote about issues in a more substantive way. This is a ongoing debate within critiques about the American media, that there's too much focus on the horse race, on the strategic game frames. We found certainly that the sort of male tendency in our data to focus on these horse race considerations led to a kind of coverage that was, although not entirely devoid of substance, certainly kept substance in the background and highlighted the political consequences and considerations of the issue itself. And I do want to point out here that when women are called upon to serve as news sources, they do seem to shape the coverage in a way that produces more gendered coverage. So just to end here with a couple of, I guess, discussion points. First, did the media cover this issue well? I think this goes a lot to questions that are very much alive in this moment. How much byline, source, and frame diversity is needed for the media to perform its functions in any democratic political system? The assumption is that the media will inform us, yes, but also present a diversity of viewpoints. There have been a lot of debates about diversifying the media more broadly. On an issue like this, again, as I mentioned, it's hard to assess the media's performance in this way. Was there not enough gender diversity in bylines, not enough in sourcing, not enough in framing? Was there too much emphasis on horse race? I think it's important to think about these things normatively because, again, outside of the context of contraception, we're also puzzling through this right now. Regardless of what you think about the answer to that question, it is pretty clear that the best, easiest, and most reliable path towards increasing diversity of news coverage is to diversify newsrooms. This just is to affirm, I think, the recommendations of many media watchdog organizations who claim that one of the most persistent problems with the American news media's coverage is its lack of diversity in newsrooms. And finally, did it matter, right? We talked a little bit about who speaks and what they say, but did it matter? Our Chapter 9 findings suggest that it does matter. When we experimentally manipulate byline diversity, source diversity, frame diversity, when we change who the author of a news report is, when we include more female sources, when we change the framing of an issue, it does seem to matter in quite interesting ways for those people who are asked to consume that news. Women who read articles in our experimental manipulations on the contraceptive mandate that were authored by other women viewed the media as more credible. The strategic game frame coverage seems to be particularly detrimental to things like political engagement, information retention, and generalized trust in the media. And of course, how the issue is framed can influence support for the contraceptive mandate itself. When questions of religious freedom are highlighted, the contraceptive mandate becomes less important. When questions about women's health are highlighted or reproductive rights, it becomes more important. So again, we see this classic finding about the framing of issues play out in our discussion of the media. So with that, I will turn it back to Rachel for some quick concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Kevin. So just briefly to add some overarching takeaways. One of the things that Kevin and I talked a lot about in this book is we are analyzing the degree to which when women are in the room, they are able to have an impact in all sorts of ways on this policy. And one thing that we noticed is there are kind of two threads to the story. One is that their presence there clearly has an impact, and obviously as a result, their absence there has an impact as well. But because we were able to connect the thread throughout, we saw a number of occasions where even when they couldn't be in the room in the moment, they were able to find ways to influence the outcomes or the discussion at other points. So just to give one example of that, you had this very high profile hearing from the House Oversight Committee that included no women, and then Nancy Pelosi and some other Democrats organized a sort of counter hearing to respond to that. And there's lots of different examples of that throughout. And so one key takeaway is when there's not a formal chair, what ways in which women were able to find other avenues for influence. The second quick takeaway I want to give us all is this is clearly a moment of a very dramatic change in our administration. That's true on a number of levels, but one of the levels is diversity of the cabinet. And a lot of what our book focuses on is the role that agencies have in determining these outcomes. And so there's a lot of things we could say about this image and the diversity there, but one thing I think we want to really think about is how this is going to matter for how policy evolves. And I think you're already seeing that take place, but I think it's worth paying some critical attention to based on the findings of our work. And last but not least, this is a really ongoing issue in the courts. It has, it's really striking. Again, you've got this very short phrase and a very long piece of legislation that has constituted a huge percentage of the Supreme Court cases on the Affordable Care Act. The birth control debate just keeps coming back. And the most recent trip to the court in Little Sisters of the Poor really did embrace Trump's kind of expanding who got to claim an exception to the mandate. And it was also strikingly Ginsburg's final dissent. And so in thinking about the fact that I doubt this will be the last time the court weighs in on this issue, I think it's worth us reflecting on who it is that's going to have a voice at the table, both on the courts, but also in other forms of debate and deliberation on this policy. So with that, thank you so much. And we would love to hear any questions.
Okay, so before we go to audience questions and attendee questions, we have a discussant, and our discussant is Jennifer Merolla. Jen has graciously agreed to spend a few minutes discussing the book.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And thank you for having me. It really, I read this book a while back, and it was really a treat to re-engage with it, especially I think in the interim, I've taught a class both at the undergraduate and graduate level on women in the American political process. And so I came to it with, some different and fresh perspectives. And so it really was a treat to do this. So first, I want to talk a bit about, why this book is a must read. And so I encourage, especially everyone here today, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, why you should. And Rachel, I think, began with the same little phrase that I pulled from the book about, one of the real advantages to this book is that it does give this 360-degree approach to understanding a policy issue. And, this is something we don't typically see in any policy domain, much less those that are related to women in the policy process. And so I think it's a really fantastic model for thinking deeply about the policy process at various stages. And so I think, that alone is one important reason to read the book. The second is that there's really careful and thoughtful consideration and theorizing about why the voices of women may differ and matter to policy debates. I think I pulled the same image that was in the slides that Rachel and Kevin had from the ISA hearing, and then also, a more recent one from the last election about, why it matters who's at the table. So, there's really thoughtful discussion of that throughout the book. I think another really important thing is really this look at framing in policy. And so, Rachel and Kevin look at a wide range of frames on this particular issue in different venues. And again, that's very rarely done and over time. And so we really do see the evolution of frames on this issue, how they shifted over time, how they vary depending on who's speaking. And so I think that's a real richness in the work. With respect to kind of the empirics, another strength of the book is that they use a number of methods, right? Both kind of qualitative, quantitative, survey data, experimental data, content analysis. And so we really have multiple angles of exploring these questions, which, I found to be really persuasive, kind of taken together, that who speaks matters, in part because it influences the nature of the debate, which in turn has important consequences for policy outcomes and public opinion. And so in the final reason why you all should read this book, as with any good and important work, it opens up a number of questions for future scholarship. And so I was going to orient the rest of my discussion to kind of what some of those questions might be. And so some of the things I wanted to talk about were gender differences in frame use and what might be driving those. And so I think that gets to, some of the question about mechanisms that Kevin brought up. Some questions about heterogeneity within women on this issue, the possibility of coalitions, and then finally thinking, further about the effective frames on policy outcomes. And so I'll talk about each of those. So I know that we only saw a subset of, some of the richness in this work today, with a deep dive into some of the chapters that deal with the media. But when you have a chance to read the full book, you'll see that there's really this consistent pattern across venues that women are more likely to use frames around health and reproductive rights than are men. So that's not just journalists, but that's also with respect to, let's say, legislators and the courts. And so one question I did have is what is driving the difference in frame use between men and women? Right. On the one hand, we could imagine that some of this, relates to differences in lived experiences that women may have. Though another possibility is also that it, may vary because of perceptions of who's credible in delivering different types of messages. And so that was kind of one other thought about, some of these mechanisms. And Kevin mentioned a few others, especially with respect to thinking about differences in the way journalists report different frames. Part of it could be different news beats. And so, this is a really important kind of follow-up question to the book, is really exploring what some of those mechanisms are. So the second point I wanted to bring up was thinking about heterogeneity within women. So are there any meaningful differences in the use or effectiveness of frames on this issue between Democratic and Republican women? It doesn't, from the analysis in the book, we didn't get to see some of those results today. That doesn't appear to be the case within Congress. But what about in state legislatures or within public opinion? So that was kind of one question I had. I also wondered whether there's any differences between white women and women of color. There's, really rich discussion within the book about, some of the concerns around contraception in women of color and some of the history, the kind of really beginning of the history around birth control and thinking about race. And so that was one question I had as I was looking at some of the findings. And I also wondered whether there were any meaningful differences depending on views toward gender roles. I think one thing that was really striking, and this is in the experimental chapter in the book, is that support for the contraception mandate was lower among women in the control group compared to men. And so that was really striking to me. Why would we see just this baseline difference even before we look at the effect of the frames? And might some of that be driven by differences, within women and attitudes about gender roles in society? And that, of course, led me to also think about this question at the elite level, right? So there's this really great chapter on the courts, and we know the courts have shifted. So, might the court findings look different right now that Amy Coney Barrett is on the court compared to, when the study was done? where most of the kind of female justices were certainly more supportive of the contraception mandate. The next area that I thought was really interesting to think about for future kind of expansion in this topic is, there's some instances in the book where Rachel and Kevin, give examples of different alliances in advancing the expansion of contraception coverage. And so one question I had, and this relates in part to some of the work we're doing in my graduate seminar this quarter, is looking at what role, if any, kind of racial coalitions in conjunction with things like the Women's Caucus have played in the politics around this issue. So do we find in kind of legislatures, either at the state or national level, that groups that maybe have been underrepresented in the political system work together to advance the interests of each other? And so that was kind of a question, and I don't know if that's something Rachel and Kevin have thought about for some of their future work. And then kind of the final question I had, thinking about expanding some of this work in the future, relates to the effectiveness of these different frames for policy. So there's definitely suggestive evidence in the book that the frames matter for policy outcomes. So there's some qualitative discussion of this with respect to kind of national level debates, and how when there was a different prevalence of different frames, it seemed to matter for the policy outcomes that we observe. And certainly the experimental findings, Kevin discussed those briefly. We do observe that when the issue is framed around women's health or reproduction, so those gendered frames, it led to higher support for the mandate. But when it was framed in religious terms, it led to lower support. And so one thing I was wondering is whether this is something that could be explored kind of at the state level, and looking at kind of newspaper coverage kind of across states and what the nature of that coverage is, and whether that's linked to some of the policy outcomes that we observe. Or it could also be not necessarily news coverage, but just debate within chambers at the state legislative level and the use of frames, and does that relate to policy outcomes? So those were, really just my main questions, mostly thinking about pushing this work forward and digging deeper from all these really important findings in the book. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Jen. So before we open things up to questions from the attendees, Rachel and Kevin, do you have any responses or thoughts based upon Jen's discussion?
Yeah, I mean, mostly I think just, all of the above, so important in terms of next steps. I really wanted to pick up on a couple of the important points you made. The first being about what happens with the new makeup of the court, and Barrett in particular. And I really think this is an important moment, because a lot of the, I shouldn't say superficial, but a lot of the sort of broad consumption of the politics of the court and gender was about Ginsburg, about the three liberal justices, but especially about Ginsburg. And I don't think that's wrong. I mean, she has such a history and a legacy of using the courts to secure women's rights. So there's a lot that her dissents and earlier on her majority opinions had to offer on this topic. But one of the things that we try to do in the book that I think we need to do even more of now is sort of get beyond that individual analysis of one high profile justice, because as you said, now that she's being replaced with another woman, that's not going to be a one-to-one transition, right? So there's really big distinctions there that I think are worth untangling. One thing I will say that is helpful on that front is that when we did our analysis of the courts, as you know, we included these amicus curiae briefs. And when you look at those, which gives us a lot more data to work with, you have a gendered impact even controlling for the position. So looking across the board with a multivariate analysis, even when you control for whether you're for or against expanding the mandate, there is a sort of isolated gender effect there. So I think all the more reason to keep pushing at that discussion. And then the second thing I want to pick up on is your really important point about race. Kevin and I have been talking about this for a long time. And one thing we find, frankly, really troubling is that, there's so much to say about race on this issue, and we were able to capture some of that, as you said, in the historical background, and we were able to capture some of it in the public opinion, where there is a small difference. On balance, Black women are less likely to be supportive, but it's small and they're still majority supportive. But you see so little discussion of race at the elite level. I mean, just honestly, a tragic lack of discussion when race is so central to all of American politics, and especially understanding of birth control. So I think one thing we've been talking about is, A, being critical of any of our blind spots on that issue, but B, how moving forward we could do a deeper dive to capture some of those voices that were not captured in the halls of Congress or in the court deliberations. Yeah, a lot of other good stuff there. I want to make sure we give other folks time as well. Kev, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just very briefly on that point. I wish we would have coded actually for absence of discussion of race, then we could have presented it as a finding. I think that might be the path forward, because what Rachel and I discovered ultimately was that, we're representing, I think, the underlying data very well. However, when we didn't explicitly code for that, it's kind of left to formats like this. So I think we could have benefited from just saying we looked explicitly for race, 0 articles were returned, and that would open the door for people who want to build on this work.
Just before I turn it over, did race pop up in the experimental work at all? Did you have a sample that allowed you to say much?
No, we had MTurk sample. So, it's kind of tough to begin with, and nothing close to the end that we would need to say anything meaningful. We look at it a little bit. We have an opinion, chapter 8 that's about aggregate level opinion. We try to get into it there a little bit, but that's plagued by all the same sort of sample size problems that we normally have. As Rachel said, there are kind of differences. I think it's important to realize, we see this with debates about the vaccine as well, that there is a kind of long-standing suspicion, particularly within the African-American community, about questions related to health and medical management, and in our case, contraception, that are totally warranted and understandable. I wish we could look at that more. The data is just not there. And if we start thinking about, of course, other racial or ethnic groups, we're nowhere close to being able to say anything meaningful. So,
okay,
unfortunately.
So there's a question from one of the panelists, Antonio Matero, asks, do you think that the reason that men tend to frame the debate in terms of religious freedom is an effort to maintain control or power over women?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's complicated, and I think it is not always an explicit goal. I think it is part of the story. And I think one of the interesting things that Kevin noted when we were talking about the gender breakdown of who got cited as an expert is that it's sort of conditioned before we even get to the article by who is perceived to be an expert to begin with, right? So you have these circles of religious experts. In many cases, they are men. And you have circle of policymakers. In many cases, they are men. So this is not to let reporters off the hook, but they are drawing on these existing pools of experts. And I think when you are looking at, religious dialogues where, to be perfectly blunt, sort of constraining women's roles is explicitly part of the goal, I think that maintaining that power structure is very important. What I'll also say, though, is because these frames become so pervasive, there are plenty of folks that would not explicitly subscribe to those power dynamics, but who just sort of internalize them and reflect them back, right? And so I think that's why you see these frame effects from a variety of different venues, some of which are, we did a lot of coding of the testimony of those speakers on the all-male panel. But it's not just them that end up embracing this perspective on, I guess this must be about religious freedom, because I keep seeing that it's about religious freedom in the news. So I think it's, a multi-layered story, but I for sure think power is part of it.
So if you try to untangle the religious part, how much of it comes down to Catholicism versus non-Catholicism?
That's a big one. I would say, in our historical chapter, we spend some time talking about sort of different religious threads, and there are frankly pretty big parallels across religions, right? You have conservative Orthodox communities that are arguing very similar things about birth control at various points. There's also, it's not a straight line history. So the Catholic Church's official position, ranges over time. And what I think is interesting about the most recent debate is that the Catholic Church, not broadly, members of the Catholic Church, but the power structure of the Catholic Church, the bishops, certain Catholic interest groups, ended up having so much of the power in sort of framing the message and being at the table. And I think one way of looking at it is the Catholic Church relative to other churches, but I think also interestingly, like looking at that strain of the Catholic Church relative to, Catholics broadly, again, so much variation there, and I don't think the full range of Catholic voices was presented. I'm not sure if that quite answers the question. Kev, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when we look at the news coverage and we look at the elite level discourse, we're talking mostly about the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, right? This is the primary religious force that's sort of exerting itself within this debate. It's tough to say. In the public opinion data, right, there's this finding in the literature broadly that affiliation is less important now than just the basic distinction between God and not God, right? This is sort of God-based gap argument within the literature on public opinion. That shows up in our work on public opinion here too, which is just another way of saying that Catholics are not all that unique, in fact, when considered alongside other religious Americans. But at the elite level, we are really talking about, I'm blanking on his name, but I think his name is Timothy Dolan, who is head of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He is sort of the primary source in news coverage and in sort of more public kinds of debates. Really, he becomes the face of opposition to the contraceptive mandate. So I think the Catholicism idea is important here at the elite level, but it's less important in understanding public opinion.
Do you think that that's true only today, or do you think that was true in the 60s and 70s as well? Is that just people are a little bit different now?
We have some data on this in the book, actually. So you go back to the 60s, and there were actually a few Gallup surveys that oversampled Catholics, because obviously the sort of composition religiously of the country was different at the time. This becomes a huge issue when Kennedy is running. So there's a lot of interest in examining Catholic public opinion. So we get a little of that. One of the most striking things was that there was a disconnect between what the bishops were saying and rank and file parishioners within the Catholic Church, even in the 60s. So I think there's an open question about how well the leadership is even representing their own parishioners on questions of contraception. Certainly, there were differences. Catholics were more opposed to birth control than other parts of the American public, but the differences were much smaller than you would have expected given what's happening at the elite level. So if you're really interested, like I said, you can read that chapter, but there's some interesting surveys from the 60s that are oversampling Catholics and asking about birth control, not questions of who should pay or who shouldn't, but instead more basic fundamental questions about morality and about some of the specific dictates of the church. At the time, the Pope's issuing some decrees about it. So there's some interesting data there. I wish we had data that rich, actually, going back, on different dimensions, like I said, race or ethnicity. But it is a story that evolves, and I think this distinction between elites and rank and file is essential in understanding the internal dynamics of Catholic thinking on this issue.
And I'll just add to that disconnect goes back, it's certainly to the 60s, and we don't have good public opinion data too much before that for obvious reasons. But from our history chapter and sort of the historical work we did there, that disconnect goes back to the time of Sanger founding the first clinics, right? You see this real power struggle between, again, rank and file parishioners, often whom were actively seeking out birth control, and sort of the higher order bishops trying. And at various points, they made it a key element of their kind of agenda, and other points were quieter about it. So the disconnect was always there. How much they centralized rallying against birth control in particular, I think, is an interesting variation.
So I'm an institutionalist. So when you start to bring up questions that are kind of institutional, I get interested. And I thought the screenshot of the agency heads and the cabinet heads was really interesting. And I don't typically think about. I mean, I don't study the bureaucracy per se, but when I think about the bureaucracy, I don't typically think about the diversity in the agency heads and at the cabinet level in terms of the policies that are produced or promulgated, the regulations. But maybe I should. Maybe I should start to think about those things. And I just did kind of a quick recap in my own head as that was showing, and just tried to think of how much diversity has actually occurred in the past. How much diversity was there under Obama, for example? You know, if we skip over Trump and just compare Biden to Obama, was there considerably less?
It was less. I would have to go back and check how much less it is. I know Biden's cabinet is the most diverse we've ever had by some metrics. I think the other thing that's really interesting about Biden's cabinet is, you know, you have a second in command in Health and Human Services now, who is the first out trans woman, representing a huge power base. It's going to weigh in on the issue specifically of the birth control mandate. So I think there's sort of interesting kinds of diversity that are going to matter there. But I absolutely think you're right that looking at the diversity of agency heads could have a tremendous role. And as you know, like the bureaucracy's influence on power or on policy is extensive.
So where are you guys going to go from here? I mean, Jen laid out some avenues if you want to move down those. Is this an ongoing project? Was this a one-off book, or is this just the first salvo in a co-authorship?
So we've had a couple of conversations. I think one of them, as Jen spoke to, deeper dives into race and to partisanship. And the other thing we've been talking about a little bit recently is expanding this analysis to other forms of birth control debates. So there was recently a big to do over the counter birth control and sort of strange bedfellows with AOC on the one hand and Ted Cruz on the other, talking about whether or not that was a good move forward. And I think we're interested in looking at whether some of these same framing debates and same gender dynamics play into those conversations.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think most of my research outside of this book is concerned with media coverage. So I think there's a lot of work actually to be done. I've been frustrated since before the time of the writing, actually, about this approach of relying on LexisNexis archives to search print news reports. And it seems like reductive and just completely out of step with the way the media space operates. So I would actually like to revisit this analysis as it pertains to news coverage of issues related to contraception, because I think in addition to not, like I said, not fully capturing what's going on here, my sense is that we started looking at this in 2011. That's when our data begins. And here we are a decade out. And the media space is unrecognizable, I would argue, and so compared to that time frame even. And so I would like to develop some of these ideas in the context of an updated understanding of the media, how it works internally, social media's relationship to more traditional forms of media, but also the role that social media plays in democratizing these debates. I think one of the less appreciated aspects of the story that we told here was the extent to which actually social media was essential in drawing attention to ICE's all-male panel. It's the kind of story that 20 years ago probably would have been ignored. It wouldn't have been covered by your local nightly news, or it would have been missed by your local newspaper. And the social media space's ability to draw attention to previously ignored issues, I think, is something that deserves further attention, because it's no longer, not to just kind of make it too simplistic, but it is no longer the case that you even require being cited or cited or quoted in a USA Today article to get attention to your views. And I would like to think about that in the context of these debates, the way that the media environment has evolved and its role in policymaking has changed.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add on to that. One of the things that we talk about that Kevin mentioned briefly in the talk was this idea of who was considered an expert. And as Kevin said, it's just a handful of people that end up getting cited over and over and over again. And we have some discussion in the book, and we have ongoing discussion ourselves about thinking about that definition of expertise being really important in politics in general, and this issue more specifically. And I would love to keep talking about the way that social media and this issue interface to change up that dynamic of who is sort of valued as an expert. And I think there are trade-offs. I don't think it's necessarily always a good thing that expertise is broadened, but I do think it has the potential power to be, as Kev mentioned, democratizing in some way, to allow kind of more kinds of voices to the table. So I'm excited to see kind of what Twitter can offer us. I don't know if I should say I'm excited to see what Twitter can offer. That sounds like a dangerous thing.
I should say you're not on Twitter, right? You need to create a Twitter.
I am not really on Twitter. Someday. Kevin's holding down the Twitter for it, right, Kevin? Are you?
No, I'm not on Twitter either. No. People always ask me, because it's like, that's what my dissertation was about. And that's what I've worked on a lot. And people are always like, why aren't you on? It's like, well, because I studied it. And,
too much.
Like one time I had the PR person at Long Beach say, like, I can set you up with a Twitter account if you want, because they noticed I wasn't on there. I was like, whoa, no, I can do it.
I choose not to.
Self-preservation strategy. Yeah,
that's right.
I guess lurking is my approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think TikTok, right? Shouldn't we be presenting our findings in TikTok format?
Okay, well, you better get your dance moves ready for that first.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any final questions. Thanks, both Rachel and Kevin, for spending time with us today. Thanks to Jen for spending part of her time discussing the great book. And I'll just say again, it's The Politics of the Pill, Oxford University Press, 2019. Available on pretty much any platform, any book platform you will go to. And thanks to the attendees, the many attendees that we have today that also participated in this. And like always, this in about a week or so, this will be on YouTube. So if you haven't had a chance to see it today, or you want to see it again, watch it again, you'll have the opportunity. So thanks again to Kevin, Rachel, and Jen. Thanks to Aubrey Hicks and Ann Johnson at the Bedrosian Center for helping me set all of this up. And for everyone taking part, have a great rest of the day and a great weekend.